Good afternoon to you all. Hello, thank you for being with us today here at Bruegel. My name is Simone Tagliapietra. I'm a senior fellow here, and I am pleased to welcome you to this event on how to finance Europe building the decarbonization plan, which is basically an event we organized also to launch a paper. This paper you can see here that is now available in our website. A paper co-authored by Ugne Kelioskaite, Ben McWilliams, Giovanni Sgaravatti, and myself. A paper that we have been working on with the support of the European Climate Foundation for one very simple reason. We think that the subject of buildings decarbonization is and will increasingly be, over the next years, a very important item in the European Green Agenda. To meet its climate targets by 2030, the EU will have to reduce significantly its emissions in the sector to an amount which is equal to the annual emissions of a country like Slovakia. The decarbonization rate of this sector will have to basically triple over the next 5 years if we are to meet our climate targets. And we know very well that this is not going to be easy. This is not going to be easy because the decarbonization of buildings, together I would say with the decarbonization of road transport, represent one of the sectors in which climate policy really enters the daily life of people. And socially and politically, this is certainly going to be a very difficult policy area to handle in the coming years. And I think we have seen in Germany and elsewhere clear examples recently of this political difficulty. What we really try to do with this paper is not only to show that this is viable, this is possible, but also the benefits of doing that. Because while we tend to focus on the difficulties, we often neglect the benefits, and it's very important to always bear in mind that buildings decarbonization is not something that is only good when it comes to emissions reduction, but is also good in terms of economic competitiveness and resilience. Think about the role of gas in the building sector and how much that can be cut down by decarbonizing this sector. Social equality, building renovation playing a crucial role in reducing energy poverty. Health, we know that most of local pollutants are, at least by half, generated by buildings in our cities, and decarbonizing the sector can have major implications on this front as well. And finally, the fiscal. And here, together with Giovanni and colleagues, we have been monitoring in the last years during the energy crisis how much governments have been spending to compensate citizens for higher energy costs, so subsidizing energy bills. And if you compare those amounts that we have spent during the energy crisis with what is required to decarbonize buildings in Europe, you really see that this is not only viable, but this really makes a lot of economic sense also for our public finances. We will have plenty of opportunities to discuss all of this. Giovanni, my colleague and co-author of this paper, will first give you an overview of the study, and we will then move into a panel discussion with what I think is a fantastic lineup today, and I thank all the participants here to be with us. And let me maybe just do a quick round of introduction for you. First speaker will be Cecilia Berthaud. Cecilia is Deputy Secretary General at the General Secretariat for Ecological Planning at the Prime Minister Office of France. Mikel joining us online, Head of the Working Group Climate and Energy Policy at PIC. Carlos Sanchez Rivero, Team Leader Financing for Energy Efficiency at the Commission. And Marion Santini, Senior Associate at RAP. Before we move into the presentation of the paper by Giovanni, let me just recall that everyone online, and we have many online today, can join us by using Slido, using the hashtag building to pose their question to the panel. Giovanni, over to you.
Thank you, Simone. Thank you everyone for being here. So I won't go over all the points Simone just mentioned on the reasons why we decided to write this paper. But I'll just add a couple of things. One is that in March this year, the European Commission and the EU institutions adopted the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive, which set energy performance targets for both residential and non-residential buildings in the EU. And this will be in parallel to the ETS II, this new carbon pricing scheme for buildings and transport. We feel that the EPBD is really crucial and fills a gap that was really important to fill for the framework, the legislative framework. And we try to assess how much is the investment needs to meet these energy saving targets by 2030. And we estimated an overall number of 150 billion per year until 2030. Okay, so we are talking, to give you an order of magnitude, of about 1% of EU GDP. It's a lot of money. Now, why are we moving so slowly with energy renovations, and why we need to speed up and there is such a massive gap? Well, we identified 5 key barriers among the many that one can find in the literature. And these are the long wait for economic returns. Final consumers often have a high discount rate on energy efficiency investments, meaning that they discount the future savings at a high rate. So the literature puts this number in a wide range of between 5% to 30%. For example, if the discount rate is 10%, 1,000 euros given to someone in 20 years from now corresponds to basically 150 euros for that person right now. So there is this intertemporal issue of high upfront costs that need to happen right now, and the long term of the benefits. The second one is that electricity is relatively overpriced. In the last semester of 2023 in Germany, electricity retail prices for households were almost four times the households' retail gas prices. And of course, even if we have much more efficient appliances for heating, like heat pumps, on average, heat pumps is around 300 times more efficient. So the energy efficiency is around 300%. And so compared to a gas boiler, which is around 90%, you need at least a ratio of 3 to 1, while currently the electricity to gas price is 4 to 1 or higher, depending on the country. Of course, this is another issue, a major one in our view. Then the third one is the lack of upfront capital for many households and SMEs, and borrowing constraints. Then split incentives. This is the most classical ones in the literature. If landlords are the ones making the decision whether to invest in energy renovations, be it thermal insulation of buildings or fuel switching, while tenants are the ones paying energy bills, then we have a misalignment of incentives. And finally, administrative burden and disaggregated demand. Of course, these energy renovations imply a lot of burden in terms of time, in terms of finding the right workers, going to the bank, ask the mortgage, etc., etc. So I'll focus how we plan to overcome these barriers and what are our proposals in the paper. So first of all, for the governments need to play a big role for vulnerable consumers and worst performing buildings, which incidentally are the buildings where low income households in most cases live. And it's important to target these type of buildings and this income quintile of the distribution, so these people, because you have a double dividend really. One is you decrease energy consumption and therefore emissions, and this puts a downward pressure on the ETS II price, because in these worst performing buildings they are the least, of course by the name, energy performing, and therefore where you can have the biggest return on investment in terms of square meter. And we estimated that, for example, renovating the 10% worst performing buildings could have an impact on the overall ETS II emissions, so also including transport, of 8%. So we can reduce by 8% the overall ETS II emissions by targeting the 10% worst performing buildings. And the second dividend links to what Simone was saying. It's a social dividend because you can tackle also energy poverty. There are around 50 million people in the EU living in energy poverty. This is gonna help them. It's gonna have positive effects also on healthcare costs, on productivity, etc., etc. And also doing that, when the ETS II price starts biting in 2027 /2030, then we can discuss, you need less compensation to these vulnerable households, right? Because if you renovated the buildings where they live upfront, then later on you don't need to support them as much, and they won't be affected as much by the ETS II price. And it's interesting to see, to put in perspective what happened during the energy crisis when we spent, well, governments earmarked 540 billion euros in 1 year and a half, and which basically corresponds to giving to 35 million households 15,000 euros, okay? 35 million households is basically the target for the renovation wave. So this is why it's important to front load this type of investment. And finally, to address split incentives, we believe that the cost of ETS II might be in a way shared between landlords and tenants. This is happening already in Germany, for example, since September last year, where the higher the emission per square meter, the greater the share of the cost that should be borne by landlords. Now, the second policy recommendation we have is on relative prices. So the price signals introduced with the ETS II are very important, but we should not stop on that. The Energy Taxation Directive was recast, has been frozen for 20 years or so, should really be put back on the table. Then we have an idea on contracts for difference for fuels, for heating, for building heating, to give price visibility and to consumers, and therefore to make some of these projects bankable, to give the investment case that sometimes is not there because there is all this uncertainty around prices. And then the most obvious one, we need to phase out fossil fuels, which are stable at around 50 billion per year in the EU, and during the energy crisis really spiked to around 120 billion. This is the second one. Then we move to what I think is the most important one, and a bit the novelty we bring to the literature, which is the importance of leveraging energy savings. And this is to tackle the barrier on the high upfront cost capital needs, and also this time discrepancy between the investment and the benefits. So if we calculated that if member states manage to meet the targets, the EPBD targets, this would imply 81 billion per year of energy savings. If we manage, so more than half of the investment need, if we manage to leverage these energy savings upfront, then we can considerably reduce the gap and the investment cost for final consumers. There are a whole set of policies and measures to do that. I'll point you to the paper, but we mentioned pay-as-you-save schemes, energy performance contracts, energy savings agreements, energy efficient mortgages, etc. Then, these schemes already are already in place in some countries, but normally to a quite limited extent in terms of funding. They are relatively novel schemes, and so we call for a wider adoption and an increase in the funding behind such schemes, which could be blended with more traditional grants or tax credits, for example. And then we move to the final two policy recommendations. One, which is also key, is the role of banks. So we really need to bring on board the private sector, because even though governments have a role to play for sure, most of the households, most of the SMEs, the companies, will need to pay for their own energy renovations. And in here, banks are fundamental. So we need to collaborate with them to create attractive, long-lasting financial products that are accessible to the widest audience possible. And to do that, we identify two pillars to make such products appealing. One is that banks need guarantees. And so one obvious collateral for such loans is the market value of properties. In 70% of cases around the EU, people live in the dwellings they own. And the majority of them, around 60%, they don't have an outstanding mortgage. And so it's important, and could be the most obvious way to use the property value to leverage loans given at the bank. But of course, not everyone is in this condition, and then there is the role of governments or public development banks to give the guarantees needed when that's not the case. And the second pillar is reducing the debt servicing costs. So proposing an appealing type of product. In France, for example, there has been this outstanding zero interest program for energy renovations, which has been, in our opinion, quite successful. And so something to imitate also in Germany with KfW. And so there are examples out there on how to do it. And we calculated that repaying the debt servicing cost has a much lower impact on public finances. We are talking about more or less 20% of the investment principal cost. So much lower than covering the investment principle indeed. My time is almost over, so I'll speed up. The final one is for the administrative burdens. We recommend a wider adoption of one-stop shops. They have been proven to be effective where they have been implemented, and we feel like they should be used to a much greater extent. And they could also help reducing the data gap that currently is in place for renovations and for the building stock across the EU, and improve maybe even the qualities of energy performance certificates. And so to conclude, bridging this massive investment gap is going to be challenging for sure, but it's important that member states use cost-effective policies. There are two upcoming deadlines for member states. One is the submission of social climate plans in June next year, by which member states need to explain how they want to spend the money of the Social Climate Fund, which is going to be set up next to the ETS II. And the second one is the national renovation plans by the end of next year. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Giovanni, and you can tell Giovanni has been leading this research because I think this space has no secrets for him anymore. So thank you for this overview. The paper is quite technical in some parts. There are annexes in there, but I think this was a very nice overview of it, and thank you, Giovanni, for that. I would then open the panel discussion, maybe starting with you, Mikel, online, and thank you again for joining, even if you need to run to another panel afterwards. And maybe, I mean, let's start with the study that you have recently published, in which you have raised the point, and we have used this study in our own paper here, that unless governments speed up the decarbonization efforts in transport and buildings, by 2030 the ETS II price could range between 70 and 260 euro per ton of CO2. So can you explain us why this is the case? And another question relates to the Polish proposal we have seen floating around when it comes to the revision of the whole ETS II system. Where do you stand on that?
Yeah, thanks so much, Simona, for the invitation and for the opportunity to speak about that very important topic and the analysis we recently did on ETS II prices. So a few words to explain the study and to put the numbers that you raised into perspective. So what we did in this analysis, we cooperated with the colleagues from E3M who operate the PRIMES model, which is frequently used to analyze price scenarios. And the specific idea was that we would like to investigate mid to long-term ETS II prices with a specific focus on the role of complementary policies. So these are overlapping policies, and a particularly relevant role is played by energy efficiency policies that were already mentioned, notably the Energy Performance of Buildings directives. And the reason to have this focus and to look at it in more detail is that we know from basic theory and also intuition that complementary policies reduce demand for allowances and thus prices. So the more policies, the more such policies we have, the more comprehensive and the more stringent they are, the lower the price will be. This is clear, but what we wanted to do in this analysis, we wanted to put some numbers behind the different policy settings. And so we looked at three scenarios. A strong scenario, meaning that we have very comprehensive and very stringent policies. A limited scenario that toned them down a little bit in terms of stringency. And a weak scenario, where we have relatively little effect in terms of demand reductions coming from these other policies. So to give you a bit of an orientation what this means without going into the detail, because this can be very fine-grained, the strong scenario is in line with the proposal, with the Fit for 55 proposal that was made by the European Commission. So it would have in it the stronger, in particularly the stronger version, the original proposal to recast the Energy Performance and Buildings Directive. So it's clearly the world we are seeing. It's clearly not the strong scenario, but it's not the limited and the weak either. We're probably somewhere in between. Hard to tell where exactly, but this is very important to keep in mind when looking at this this results. And the results are, to link that back to the numbers you said, in the strong scenario, we only see in the model relatively limited increase up to 70 euro per ton. In the limited scenario, we have around 160, and in the weak scenario, we have a price of around 260 euro per ton in 2030. So just one more word and a caveat. So it's clear that there is already a substantial impact on price from these different policy settings, but it's not the whole story. There are a lot of other drivers that can shift prices upwards and downwards. So I'm saying this to put this a little bit into perspective, and I will come back to it shortly when explaining how we might transition from 2027 to 2030. So what would this mean if we find ourselves in one scenario or the other? So you already analyzed in the study that the price, ETS II price of around 200 euro per ton, would mean an impact on the average EU households, notably the one that use natural gas boilers, that would be slightly higher than the impact of the energy crisis. So that's apparently a lot. And it has raised concerns about distributional impacts, not just now, but basically since its inception, and since we have a better understanding of how high prices could be. And it has led to some concerns, and then some to voiced concerns, and recently also to a very concrete proposal that you mentioned, Simone, by Poland, which I understand as offering or suggesting to postpone the introduction of the ETS II for a few years, and also, if I got that right, to differentiate the prices. So the logic here would be that member states who have a particularly high burden because of the situation in the building sector and transport sector would have then lower prices, and vice versa. So that's my understanding. And how can we think of that, or what would be my take in terms of taking a stance on this proposal? So first of all, I think it's important to acknowledge that, as I already mentioned, these prices, if they would rise as high as in the weak scenario, would mean a substantial burden, substantial financial burden, also incentives, but let's focus on the burden for now. And that in particularly applies or pertains to countries like Poland. And it's, I think, important to note that in the country, there's a considerable share of households that even use coal for heating. So we're not talking natural gas heating here, we are actually talking coal heating. And so with respect to that situation, it's quite understandable. But that said, would it actually help both Poland and the climate if we would go that way? And here I have to say I have my doubts, and for a variety of reasons. So the first one is more general and has to do with the EU climate target. And the later we start with such a system, the more expensive it will become later on. So we need to achieve climate neutrality in 2050. And postponing for just 2 or 3 years does not sound like a lot, but we have to be aware of the fact that the cap in the new ETS needs to go down to 0 in around 16, 17, 18 years or so. So you would basically take 2 or 3 years out, which is then a substantial cut in terms of the time that we have to go down to 0 with emissions. So any cost burden would only pop up later on. The second point is there is usually, when you talk about prices and price scenarios, then most attention is attracted by the extreme scenarios. In that case, it's the 260 euro per ton scenario. But is this high price scenario a likely scenario? We cannot tell. It's a possible scenario. So it's one world that could materialize. Given where we stand, I think it's more likely, or it's probably an outlier, it's an extreme, as I just mentioned. So it's just a possibility. And what is important about that possibility is that it's not given. So it's not an external shock or something. We really can influence it by the choice and implementation of additional policies. And this is where your suggestions and recommendations come in. And as a further remark on the timing issue, we are talking about prices in 2030. So it's not 2027. It will not fall on us basically after 2 years. So there's still some time left in which we could take actions to deal with this prices. And then finally, and here I'll offer another or deeper interpretation of what I said. So it's not about postponing. And my understanding is also about implementing differentiated prices. So would this make sense? And again, there is an intuition if you say a country will be hit harder by high prices than others. So why not differentiated price? And my reply here would be that de facto we already have differentiated prices if you take or if you account for the revenues and the transfers. So the higher the price rises, the higher the revenues are from selling allowances. And this money can exactly be used for what Giovanni was talking about, to finance investments in energy efficiency and the renovation of buildings. Plus, there is another institutional element that was created and that was already alluded to, the social climate fund. And with this fund, or the idea of this fund is to have transfers to ensure solidarity so that countries that are particularly hit hard gain additional transfers from countries who are in a better situation. So that would also need to be stripped if you differentiate the prices. So and there's a lot to be gained here, I think, in the social climate fund, also with regard to the momentum it creates for implementing the necessary policies. So before closing, or I want to close with 2 short remarks with regard to what I think how the time that remains before the ETS II starts operation should optimally be used. And I think there is some more momentum would definitely help. And I think awareness of what could happen helps in that regard. So the first one is really start and engage in the implementation of complementary policies. So there are now a lot of good ideas on the table, but a lot of action needs to be done on the regulatory level to implement this. Also because so far we are at the stage of having proposals and that need to be further fleshed out, specifically with regard to targeting the necessary households or the most hit households and the worst performing buildings. And secondly, on the level of price formation, so indeed, it will come as a sort of surprise in 2027. No one knows how high the price will be and how it will develop. My guess it would start early and then only gradually rise towards the midterm levels. But what we could do in addition is we have some options available with regard to market design that would help us to learn about the prices earlier on. So one of that would be early auctions, so that we auction allowances earlier, maybe 1 or 2 years, to learn about how high the price could be without actually trading, but also to front load revenues, again, to get these policies on the way and finance it, or to use price indices or something like that, that we really get a better understanding of where we would land in 2027. And I think this is exactly how the time that remains should be used.
Thank you, Mikel, for this overview. And I think this links very well to a question I wanted to ask Marion, which really looks at the equity and the equity dimension of this issue, the distributional implications of these policies in general, and the ETS II have been discussed by both Giovanni and Mikel, and you have done several publications in this space on how to construct buildings, decarbonization policies. Now, how would you see equity in this space? How to place equity issues at the core of this policy design, and how can governments really target specific vulnerable groups here? The floor is yours.
Well, thanks a lot, Simone. And I have to say, at the Regulatory Assistance Project, we were very interested into the issues that were just brought up by Mikel. So during the Fit for 55 negotiations, we followed very closely the development of the emission trading proposals and, of course, the development of the Buildings and Energy Efficiency Directive. And how do we make building decarbonization policy more equitable? It's a very large debate, but it's one we need to have now. So let me start by saying that when we're talking about buildings, we're actually mostly talking about homes and the people that live in these homes. And what we know is that for many people, access to energy is an issue right now. And the situation got worse with the energy crisis. And in 2022, almost 1 out of 10 Europeans were not able to adequately heat their home. So one of the reasons for energy poverty is the poor quality of the building stock. And Giovanni was mentioning that in many member states, basically low-income households live in these worst-performing buildings. So we know that renovation can help with energy poverty, but what we have seen so far is that governments have mainly used social measures to address poverty. And you mentioned the calculation that were done on the money that governments have spent during the energy crisis to support people. So it's a huge amount. And yes, and we need to understand why how this situation emerged. So what we have observed at RAP is that renovation policies tend not to reach poorer households unless they are specifically designed to do so. And so as we progress towards the energy transition, there is a risk that richer households are able to insulate their house, change their heating systems, and poorer households remain stuck on fossil fuel and with a house which is not well performing. And that's a risk. It would increase the gaps that we already have in our societies, and it will decrease the acceptance for the energy transition. So we think that we need to prioritize renovations among low-income and vulnerable groups. But how do we do that? Well, I think the very first step is to be aware that we need to ring-fence public funding for this particular objective. If we support projects, the projects that I mentioned, as part of a pot where other projects would compete, there is a chance that those projects don't get funding because they might be more complex and they might be slightly, in some cases, less cost-effective. So there is really this need to have dedicated funding for that. And I think here we can discuss the use of emission trading revenues in that aspect. Then there is also a need to understand why different groups are not in a position to invest. And we mentioned a lot of economic barriers, so I'm not going to go back to those ones, but I just want to stress that there are other barriers and other reasons not to invest. Just for example, if you're already struggling to make ends meet, you're very unlikely to have the time to engage into a renovation project, and this is something that needs to be taken into consideration when designing building renovation policies. Once there is a good understanding of the drivers for renovation and the barriers to renovation, then policies can be designed and they can be tailor-made for each of these groups. And we really need to look specifically at each of the groups to understand what the problems are and be able to propose solutions that actually work for them. So let me just give you a couple of examples of what we've seen in member states. We know that there are some programs that offer higher rates of subsidies for low-income households. That's the case here in the Brussels region. So the Renovations subsidy scheme provides higher rate of subsidy for the lower-income groups. Now, in some cases, this subsidy can go up to 100%, and that's the case in Ireland, where there is a program that fully funds energy upgrade for certain houses. And I'd like to pause a minute on this Irish program because it also gives you an example of the challenge that it is to actually target the vulnerable people with such a policy. So in Ireland, what they did is that they have restricted the eligibility of the program to owners that occupy their homes. So in Ireland, the ownership rate is, I think, about the same than in the EU. So it's quite high. And the participants to the program, they have to be beneficiaries of a list of social benefits. So Ireland is using social benefits eligibility as a proxy to identify vulnerable groups. And they also further restrict the access to houses that were built before 2006, because afterwards there were some good building codes and the buildings are in a better state. So it's quite interesting to see that the design of the eligibility criteria can be quite delicate, because you want to be precise enough so that you target the people you want to target, but at the same time you need you need this eligibility criteria to be understandable. So it's a real challenge. There are many other challenges and many other ways to improve building policies, and I don't have time to go through everything, but I'll just perhaps mention that it's quite important that there is a comprehensive policy framework that look at all aspects of building decarbonization policies. And I think you mentioned rent regulation. I think it's quite important to deal with renovations in the rented sector. And just to conclude, I think we need to be humble and recognize that there's a lot of space for improvement in that field, and that the discussion basically needs to happen now because of the reasons we just mentioned and Mikel just mentioned on the carbon prices.
Marion, and I think we have already put a lot of elements from the researchers' side on the table, so I will now turn to the policymakers finally. And maybe Cecilia, I will start with you and also to discuss a perspective from France. France, among the 5 biggest European countries, is the one that achieved the most emissions reductions in this sector over the last 20 years. If we look at the investment needs in the building decarbonization, they remain very high in the country. So how do you, in France, plan to bridge this investment gap? And how do you see this policy mix we have been discussing overall? Over to you. Thank you.
For the invitation, and I'm happy to present what we've been doing in France. So buildings is really at the heart of the program, and I come from a new general secretary that was put in place 2 years ago to try to have a comprehensive view on all the issues related to ecological transition. So it's not only decarbonization, but it's also adaptation, biodiversity, resources, and health. I wanted to maybe start by saying that indeed we're on a favorable trend in France with the buildings emissions that are going down by 12 million tons in the last 3 years. And 2/3 of this we estimate is from structural policy. And 1/3 is from a better climate, this type of thing. We have 4 objectives for buildings to reduce, but I want to insist that it's not only decarbonization. So we have to achieve -60% of greenhouse gas emissions in the building sector, because we estimated that to achieve the Fit for 55 objectives, the 2 sectors that could give the most reduction were transport and building. And then we were thinking, do we have to have the same reduction for all subsectors, so public buildings, etc. And yes, we're putting throughout the sector, it's the same -60%. But this is clearly not enough. We also have issues on energy consumption, on energy poverty that was said, and on adaptation. And I insist on this because if you only look at greenhouse gas emissions, this leads you to choosing public policies that are changing fossil fuel boilers, and this is not enough. We do need to work on energy consumption. This is for acceptability, but it's also for our electric grid in France, notably. And it's also for energy poverty. Just changing a boiler in a bad performing building is going to cost more to the household, and it's not going to improve its situation. So it's all these objectives together. And so we now have a policy that really says it's changing fossil fuel boilers, and it is going for deep renovations. I insist because deep renovations, it was said before, is slow to come up. So we have indicators that are actually going not as fast as we would like, and we're before we had hundreds of thousands of individual actions. Now we have to understand that, well, it's less deep renovations, but it's actually better for the climate. And this reform, we also did it by supporting more the people who had less revenue and who were going for higher and deeper renovations. Coming to the issue of targeting lower income households, there may be 3 things that we believe in the plan will help. The first one is the regulation. So we have a regulation in France that says that it's no longer possible to be renting a worse performing building. This has become indecent, and this is going to be put in place progressively depending on the energy consumption of your building. So this means that actually it's the landowner who will have to pay for it, and statistically the landowners have higher incomes than the others. It's also renovation of social housing. In France, it's about 17% of the residential buildings are social housing, and by definition, it's for lower income households. And we also have these subsidies that give more money to lower income households. I'll give an example. If you have a worst performing building and you're in the lowest incomes, you get 90% of up to 70,000 euros to renovate your building. So it's really actually quite high. Then I also wanted to say that we talk about buildings, but it's actually very different from sector to sector. It's not the same thing for public sector buildings or for the private non-residential. To give an example, and the policy mix we are putting in place is quite different. We're relying exclusively on regulation for the private non-residential buildings, and we're relying on regulations and 100% public financing for the public non-residential buildings. For the residential buildings, I'm not missing, it's 50%. So all these different policy measures, it's grants, it's tax rebates, it's regulation, but I also want soft loans also, but it's also coaching. This was a bit alluded to, but we have a new program in which we believe a lot. It's called My Renovation Companion, Mon Accompagnateur Rénove, starting this year. It's taken a lot of time to be put in place, but it's something we really believe strongly in. It's supposed to help the households technically, financially, to put their project together and help them with the enterprises that will be doing the things. It's targeting. This means involving local authorities. So we will now have in each local authority will have to have its strategy and a place where households can go as a first one-stop shop. And the idea is that each local authority should have its own strategy, be it, for instance, I target worst performing buildings for poor households, or on the contrary, they could also say, if I'm in a dynamic market, I'm going for those who can renovate fast. I'm putting two extremes, but the idea is that we have a targeting strategy. And a point that maybe was not mentioned a lot before, I want to insist on, is the industry. It's the training. We're supposed to have 200,000 people in the French renovation sector, in addition to what we have now, by 2030. That's not just going to be coming alone. To some figures, already it's more than half of the value added of the sector is for renovation, 45% is for construction, but only 4% of training is for renovation in France. We do need to operate this very strong change, and it's not evidence. I mean, those that are in construction, they don't spontaneously want to change for renovation. So for this, we do need to have a trajectory, a visibility, and a long kind of lasting public policy and not be changing every other month. Actually, we're not relying on ETS II. This will, we believe, help when it's put in place, but it's not one of the levers that we have mobilized. And something I wanted to insist, because it's also to do with ETS II, is that if we achieve the targets, so the minus 60% of greenhouse gas emissions I was talking about, will be like 10 to 12% of households will have a new heating system, decarbonized, and 10 to 12% will be fully isolated or renovated. And there's some overlap, so it's not 24%, it's... but you see, in a way, it leaves 85% of households who, even if we achieve this huge plan, which means that we're renovating 1 million buildings every year, we will only have, 85% will be subject to the new ETS, and we cannot go faster. Already we have put everything in place. So it's also to say that if we want to achieve the climate targets, we do not need to go for the most difficult renovation with the lowest income household. So there's a kind of a policy choice to be made. But it does mean going faster. I was saying it's 500 deep renovation, 1,000 and 500,000 change in oil or gas heaters. And then we have an accountability issue, and we need to know what we're measuring. And I want to insist that we don't want to be measuring only euros spent. We need to be measuring actually reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, because sometimes there's a debate on how much money we should put. At the end of the day, we want to say that what we want is to achieve the target. And if we put less money, great, but this is what has to guide us. Quickly on the funding, the orders of magnitude that have been published are coherent, and basically for the buildings, it's 2/3 of the additional funding by 2030 will be in buildings in France. And even more so if we're talking about public funds. It's 48 billion euros more by 2030. So we need to find them somewhere. And the public-private leverage, we believe we have to look at it very precisely. We cannot say, oh, we have 50%, let's reduce it or let's increase it. An example, I was saying in public buildings, honestly, this is public money. And if it's private buildings, in France we have 0, so we cannot really go lower. So we can maybe discuss for residential buildings. But here, if we want to reduce the amount of public money, I guess the most effective way is by putting regulation. But here we have then a political decision to be made, and in France the decision was made to not add more regulation. And then we have a trade-off. So if I want to put less public money, then I will have less deep renovations, and I will have more rich people, less lower income households. So I don't think that the public-private leverage should be really guiding, or if it guides, we have to be, it's not a financial engineering issue, it's a political issue that has to be discussed and debated. So how are we going to achieve this? So regulations, we've said we have them, we have to keep them and have some visibility. The public and private public funding trajectory, we also have, and we need to pursue it. And here we have this ambitious reform since the beginning of the year. The industry is, of course, asking to be changing, and I hope we will keep the direction, because we will not go for deep renovations unless there's a consistent policy for this. In terms of financial engineering, I admit that I'm a bit dubitative, because I think it may be done maybe for some public buildings or some private non-residential buildings. For households, I have more doubts, because you have a lot of risks to be mitigated, you have to measure them, and at the end of the day, it's costly, complicated, and I think something that the balance doesn't go in that favor. And on ETS, I will finish with this by saying that we're discussing still in France between investment and compensation. To be honest, given what I was saying, if we put, even if we achieve our targets, we'll have 15%, let's say, of buildings renovated, we'll still have 85% that are not, and there's a strong push for more compensation. So I do not believe, and the figures, they don't really work out. ETS will not give, for the French public policy, enough money to finance the plus 20 billion euros that we will need for buildings renovation. The numbers just don't add up well. So to conclude, we have to be aware that every subsector is very different. We need to be guided by physical objectives and not how much money we put in it. The public policy mix has to include regulation and public financing. There is no miracle outside of this also. And voilà. We need also a big change for the sector and be working, I think, also at the European level on the fact that this is a policy that's here to stay.
Yeah.
Voilà.
Sure. Thank you so much, Cecilia, for that. Let me just thank Mikel for being with us, because I know, Mikel, you need to go to your next commitment, and thank you for making it into your schedule today, and it was appreciated, your intervention. We will continue with the debate now, but I will make sure to debrief you on the debate after the event. So thank you for being with us. And let me turn to you, Carlos, and thank you for waiting. I think there are, Cecilia stressed a couple of times the need to stay on course. Now, over the last 5 years, many policy action has been undertaken at the EU level in this space, I would say, an unprecedented degree of interventions, both on the sticks and the carrots. So now we have a toolkit, which is pretty comprehensive. What's your expectation for the next 5 years? How do you see the implementation of all of these? How do you see the interaction between the various policies we have been putting in place? The floor is yours.
Thank you. First of all, I would like to congratulate you for the policy brief. Can you hear me well? Good. No, I mean, indeed, I think the legislative framework that has been adopted in the last years as part of the European Green Deal, and more concretely as part of the Fit for 55, is indeed very, very comprehensive, first of all, and ambitious. It is done in a way that, I think now I've heard that everything, all the different initiatives are interconnected and are complementary. So that's, I think, the logic, and I think it is very clear when we see the ETS II, for instance, on the price signal, and how this, for instance, will contribute to the effort sharing the regulation. No? That's one element. But then it comes the clean energy transition that we all know it is fundamental to deliver on the climate transition, because basically emissions from the energy sector account for 75% of the total emissions in Europe. No? And here we have renewables and with the shares on buildings, on the share of renewable energy for buildings by 2030, and of course we have the provisions on the ED and the EPBD. It has been already mentioned very importantly, the EPBD setting obligations that relates to, first of all, to the non-residential building stock, so commercial real estate at the level of individual buildings, and also setting an obligation for a trajectory for the residential sector, but also to mention as well that on the ED and efficiency directive, it is also very relevant, I would say, for two things. First, on the overall energy efficiency binding target at EU level, because again, building sector is fundamental in achieving and in delivering on that. At second as well, on the specific provisions for buildings, on the public sector. So also complementing the EPBD with obligations of 3% of renovations of public buildings owned by the different layers of the national administration and regional and local. No? So also very important, and that's all. So we can say that indeed the legislative framework is very strong, and that comes implementation. So next 5 years, in principle, will be dedicated to implementation. And of course, this is very, very important because I think all has been created and all it is interconnected with the objective of being able to deliver and being able to implement. Of course, consequences of not being able to implement it properly will also impact not only one initiative, but a number of initiatives. So that's also an important element to take into account. So on that, Commission is already working, of course, in full motion towards that. First of all, providing recommendations and guidance to member states on how to, of course, transpose and also implement the different pieces of legislation. In particular, I would say I will refer to the ED or the EPBD. So this work is already ongoing, and member states are, of course, as mentioned by Cecilia, they are already working for years, anticipating what is going to be adopted on implementation. No? So that's very important: transposition and implementation. We're talking, I think you were mentioning what are the main, policy documents that will become in the next years in terms of how member states they are planned to achieve and deliver. I think one important as well is the final NECPs that were due by last 30th of June. So now we're getting a first batch of these final NECPs, and we'll get in these NECPs in the next weeks and hopefully weeks. And well, basically, those are also very, very important because they are going to tell how member states they are planning to deliver on that, and in particular, including on efficiency and on building renovation. So that will be a very important piece of implementation. So, and we like to bring the element of financing because it is the main element of the study, and I think most of the interventions we all know it is a key enabler of the building renovation objectives, and here I would like to mention that there are three important elements. So first, that we'll do an effective and efficient use of public funds. We have mentioned it already that, but it is important to take this into consideration because we have 50% more or less of the public of the total funds, total investment needs can be covered with public funds, but the rest will need to come from the private sources, no? So that will come, as you were saying, at the end we are talking about individuals, we are talking about households, no? So this is clear, we need to take this into account. But it was very striking, I think, the figure that you managed to collect in the report, so 81 billion euros of energy savings if we implement fully the EPBD. So, I mean, we need to factor in this as well, and also in deploying financial schemes, we need to find ways to take advantage of that. And the advantage is energy efficiency pays back. So it's we need to find the way on how to take this into consideration, but we cannot just propose grant schemes because we are not going to be able to deliver probably on the objectives if we focused only on that. So also targeted support very important. Mariano was mentioning, of course, that there are specific sectors of our population that we need to receive the specific support. So it is not only one market here, so we need to address the market, in segments. So segmentation, very important. And of course, and pretty much linked to what I mentioned at the beginning, so we need to be able to leverage private investments. And on that, I would like to mention one initiative of the Commission, that it is the European Energy Efficiency Financing Coalition, that it is aiming at setting a framework for cooperation and dialogue with member states, first of all, and second with the financial sector, with financial institutions. We launched the Energy Efficiency Financing Coalition following the signature of the joint declaration on energy efficiency financing by all 27 ministers in December 2023, and we launched very recently by our commissioner the coalition in April this year. So this is really aiming at having significant, positive impact on implementation, because the idea is to put on the table member states, Commission, financial institutions, but also other key actors of the supply chain in the member states through national hubs, and to find ways of being able to deliver on these challenges, considering of course the huge investment needs, and of course taking into consideration that public funds are significant, important, much higher than what we had in the past, but still they will not be able to make it by themselves. So we need to be able to find ways of combining support from the public and the private sector in a way that will be effective. So I think that's very good, and also that member states are interested, and the 27 member states that decided to sign the joint declaration and join the coalition. I think it is already a very, very good sign that we are all together in that. We all understand that it is a challenge, the implementation, and we need to find the ways, because it was also mentioned today that I think we need to go beyond implementing some good practices or pilot schemes that they are particularly good, and we are good students because we are implementing these pilot schemes. No, it's about mainstreaming the support for building renovation in a way that it is sustainable in the medium and long run in terms of public finances, first of all, but also being able to deliver on the objectives. And I will finalize by mentioning, I think, two important things that we need to achieve if we want to have a successful implementation. First is we need to focus on demand. So, as I said, we need to have segmentation. We need to be able to devise financing schemes that look in the eyes into the households, and they are easy, that are accessible, they are timely. We're talking about how to upfront support for them. We need to be able to create a supply chain that it is reliable, that we can trust. Cecilia was saying that this is a fundamental element, and I fully agree with that. And we need to be able as well to see how we can cover some of the costs, some of the risks that are preventing households to take a decision to invest. And in some cases, those risks are financial risks, but some other cases are also performance risk. So based on what will be the final energy performance of my buildings. And we need to find ways, because that could be costly, but I think it is most costly when setting grant schemes. And the second point, very important, I think the actions that will be taken in the next years, considering the significant amount of money that we are going to deploy, so 1% of the GDP, we need to be compatible with preserving and possibly fostering the competitiveness of the member states and the EU overall.
Thank you, Carlos. And I think you raised a number of points. I personally retained two key issues in there. One is the need to make the best use of NECPs, and to my eyes, that really starts with member states putting forward clear estimates about investment needs. We struggle to see a clear view, clear numbers in the NECPs when it comes to the investment needs. In France, Pisani-Ferry and Mahfouz did a major study on the investment dimension of the transition. Difficult to see similar analysis in other countries. That's a key prerequisite to, in my view, to start really understanding how to better calibrate policy. And then the focus that both you and Cecilia put on the supply chain. As the green agenda will be driven by the industrialization angle, I think it's indeed, and we try to do that in the paper as well, it's important to stress that this is a sector where a lot of jobs can be created, where European companies are strong, and jobs are both on the manufacturing and the deployment side, are very well distributed across the Union and across our countries, and therefore I think it's certainly attractive also from that perspective. Now I think we have still 10 minutes to go into a question and answers session, and I would start with you in the room. I see already a question in here and then down there, so we can group a couple of questions and turn to the panel and have another round afterwards, please.
Yeah, Helmut von Glasenapp, European Long-Term Investors Association. I'm representing public promotional banks and institutions which were mentioned already. I would like to start with what we see all over the place in Europe, which is a political shift, and it is partly also a reaction to all the measures we are discussing here, but much more as well. And we have to be very careful. We saw more than 10 years ago a scheme for housing renovation in Bulgaria, and people in Bulgaria hold in mind, it's just costly, we don't do it. So you can take public money and reach with an incentive scheme exactly the opposite you would like to reach. So it's very, and you pointed on this, it's really crucial to look at successful schemes. You mentioned also some of the schemes from KfW, or we saw something more than 10 years ago already in Estonia. So there is a lot of know-how we can transfer to other member states. What we see from the reaction of our members, and I'm representing here 22 member states, it is a question of permissions on top of financing. It's a question of permissions. It was discussed as well, but this is becoming a more and more crucial issue, that authorities who have to look for this, it takes too long because it's too complicated. And this leads me to the statement that we need for at least private household buildings, for the dwellings, we need standard projects. They are defined and they are fitting or not, but otherwise you won't reach high numbers. And at the European level, we need to reduce red tape. The EU financial regulation will add even more reporting elements. That's something which will limit the room for maneuver for the European Commission. My question would go to a statement Cecilia made, by the way. We need 48 billion euros. until 2030, and we need to find it somewhere. I think the discussion about public funds will become more difficult because member states have to put more money to the defense budgets. So where will this money come from, this public money? This is, for me, the crucial question, because if you can't finance incentives, and I fully agree what was said, we need to finance incentives and not 100% of the measures, then we... Yeah, okay.
The next, so we can collect a few of them. Maybe you can go down there, thank you.
Alessio Terzi with the European Commission. A quick question, I guess, regarding the paper, so to Giovanni and yourself, Simone. You, at the end of your intervention, you were talking about supply chains and the importance of the whole supply dimension. I was wondering if, comparing this sector, which I know very little of, with other sectors related to the decarbonization, it feels like we're looking a lot for price savings. And this is not something that I've heard you speak a lot of in terms of the scope for bringing down the costs of decarbonization. And so is there scope to bring these costs down for deep renovations or decarbonization of heating? Or in other words, in a more provocative way, do we need an industrial champion of heat pumps in Europe? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I would then turn to the panel, maybe with the first question concerning the administrative capacity and whether or not permitting time plays a crucial role. Maybe Cecilia, you can bring your view on that.
So we have a scheme that's called MaPrimeRénov' in France. I did not say it, but we have about 700,000 renovations each year, so it's already quite massive. I was talking about the renovation companion. It's 4,000 coaching companions this year. So I think in France we actually have reached a size that's about deploying massively, and I was saying that at the end of the year we have to have in each local authority a one-stop shop. So we're no longer piloting, we're really deploying massively. This also shows, and it's normal, that it's not so easy, so we're finding difficulties along the way, but already we're kind of changing people's lives. So, and each time a new burden comes up, we try to change it. And you cannot have a reform that works perfectly. So this is, I think, a continuously ongoing and improving policy. I wanted to say too, maybe to answer and we have the companion, because we want to help people out, and this was seen in France as one of the major problems. If it's too difficult for people, they will not go for it. So this companion is supposed to help you and tell you for your house, it would be best to do this or that, and help you find the subsidies and put in place the dossier to go to the bank. This is the idea. Quickly on the 48 billion, to be honest, it's more or less 50-50% for public and private funding. We have worked a lot to try to reduce the public side, but we do not really see how to go much lower. At the end, and 48 billion is for the year 2030, it's actually more each year before. I think at the end of the day, it's a political decision. And that's why I was saying also there are physical objectives. Do we want to achieve the objectives or not? And then we have to put the money in front. I do not think that there is miracle recipes. Maybe they will change a little bit, but they will not be so massive as to fundamentally change the leverage if we do want to go for worse performing buildings and or lower income households and public buildings.
Thank you very much. Maybe Giovanni, on the supply chain question, 1 minute.
Yeah, it's a good one. Thank you, Alessio. And I would link it also to what the previous gentleman was asking. And I think there is a role there to play for one-stop shops in aggregating different projects and therefore making the investment case, making these projects bankable, really. Which kind of links also to what Cecilia was saying before that, and which I share, that some of the proposals we have for some of these measures maybe are not really fit for purpose for single dwellings, but if we find a way to aggregate them, and the one-stop shops could really do that, then they do become these measures appealing and can be implemented. And in terms of heat pumps, of course the two things go together, right? Fuel switching and renovations. I think our country, Italy in particular, is quite well placed in terms of manufacturing of heat pumps. And we have a competitive edge. So I think we should definitely exploit it. Heat pumps are becoming better and better and cheaper every year. So that's a really good point. Thank you.
Yeah, and if you allow a little advertisement, on the Bruegel website you find the European Clean Tech Tracker, where you have a map of Europe with all the heat pump manufacturing sites, and you see how distributed they are across Europe. So again, it's a distributed dimension here, which is, I think, very important for the politics of the green transition. Moving forward. Now, I would like to get one of the questions online, maybe to you, Marion and Carlos. There is one related to the energy crisis, which I find quite intriguing. So is there any lessons we can learn from the energy crisis and what we did to protect consumers back then when it comes to the future distribution of the ETS II revenues? Maybe, Mario, you want to take it?
Sure.
Yeah.
So what we can learn from what happened during the crisis is that those measures to support people, they were important. And as Cecilia was saying, we are not going to renovate all buildings in the next 5 years, so there will be a need to continue this support, and I think that's why also some part of the social climate fund, it will be possible to use it for this purpose. So it's quite important it's quite an important aspect of building policy. Now, what happened during the crisis, and it's mainly due to the emergency that we were facing, is that the measures were not always very targeted. And because governments had to rush, sometimes here in Belgium, they distributed the same amount to all families, and it didn't work out. So I think while we understand better the different segments, we can better target.
Lessons on how not to do it then. Maybe, Carlos, to close on the utilization of the Social Climate Fund, what will be the role of the Commission in steering the formulation of the national plans that Giovanni was referring to before?
Well, I mean, I think we have already experience on how to deal with plans. That, I mean, what we have an instrument from the EU budget that is based on plans. So we have these traditional, for instance, cohesion policy funds that have these operational programs that are already an example. But more concretely and more recently, we also have had the recurrent resilience facility, and in particular the recurrent resilience plan. So there is quite a lot of, I think, already understanding on how to collaborate on this. That I think the idea would be to have an interaction between member states first, and then the Commission in the early stages before entering into the formal stages that require the submission of the plan, etc., etc. No? So I think the idea would be to count on that as well. So to be quite dynamic in that exchange. That I think it has been successful, because indeed it has been already mentioned. I think this is a new scheme, but potentially very, very relevant to address. We're coming back to the segmentation, a particular sector.
Thank you, Carlos, Cecilia, and Marion. I think I wanted to thank you again for being with us today. Thank you to all of you for having come to this event. How to Finance Europe Building Decarbonization Plan is now online, is now yours. Make the best of it, and thank you for your attention. All the best.